All right, welcome to the series. We're going to be talking about planning and budgeting under governance. And we will basically a few new concepts, all of which are going to be useful for understanding this week's case on the SPPU and the European Commission. One is going to be just introducing the concept of multi-level governance itself. We'll be reinforcing definitions of public management policy. You'll be learning more about activity-based management, which is a budgeting and planning feature, or I guess really it's a way that budgeting planning is done. And we'll also be thinking a little bit more about these theoretical concepts of structural holes and brokerage and how that relates to a process of actor certification. So first, just a little bit about multi-level governance. Anytime you're actors that are situated at different territorial levels, you can think about these as the multi-level type relationships. So if you think in the US, for example, if you've got the EPA coordinating with like a state level agency and maybe even to implement some set of policies, that's multi-level governance. In the EU, we're talking EU, and then there are member states, and sometimes there's even local levels. In essence, what that means is that you have these public authorities that are in charge of this policy implementation of a policy, or in some cases, an entire policy domain, that are belonging to, they basically have different representative constituencies of competence. And when you're working, say, you have people who don't have as much background as someone who might be working at. This idea of multi-level governance has actually been around in political science for a long time, but it's really been revived in the political with recent studies, even it's as multi-level governance issues are as common in the U.S. in many cases, particularly in many laws or other, even our transportation, et cetera, policy domains. So one issue, of course, with multi-level governance is there are actually quite a few complications that get presented with any multi-level organization. If you think about it, what you're dealing with is what is in essence a geographic hierarchy in most cases that isn't actually the same as an organizational hierarchy, right? So there are no sort of direct reporting lines between a federal government and a state government, or between even the EU Commission and state level or country level governments in the EU. So you have a lot of status ambiguity that leads to questions about who's in charge, whose job is it. So this is going to introduce a lot of gray space. Some people might think, well, this is a country level job. Other people think, well, no, this is a local level job, or it's actually an EU level job. Status ambiguity over who's in charge can also produce a lot of backlash. So if the EU does something that member states don't like, you can definitely expect backlash. Conversely, you could even imagine backlash. So you'll see we have some status, even at certain levels, you can have status ambiguity. So in the EU, the Commission itself, we can have status ambiguity. So we actually expect backlash there. So this is the sort of next issue of peer competition. In essence, when you have something like the EU, where you have a lot of different member nations that are all at the same level, and there's not a clear hierarchy amongst them, then you also will tend to get this peer competition, so you can get backlash and interference. Also, of course, we know status ambiguity will tend to produce gridlock. So in essence, you can't get to a point where anyone can agree on what policy to do next, and so you can tend to run round and round in circles with sort of different forms of agenda setting. So you could also basically get failure to implement, because as we saw, say, in the Michigan case and earlier cases in the term, anytime you get this ambiguity where you can get conflicting messages, often the people who are doing the implementation are just not sure what to do, and so they sort of freeze like a deer in headlights. Another issue is, in essence, that because you've got silos, in some cases not silos going down, but actually silos at the different levels, you can actually have difficulty communicating. So the language and the sort of understanding of a particular policy domain at a national level might look very different than it does at a local level. And that can really cause significant issues. In some of those of you who are sort of looking some at the Flint water case will see that, in fact, part of the issues can be the way that things get conceptualized and thought about at the EPA are not the same as it's getting thought at the local public water works, even when, in fact, they're sort of dealing in the same policy domain. And again, the ultimate source of a lot of this is, in essence, all these underlying dotted lines. So the dotted lines are what are sort of driving a lot of this status ambiguity, and also they themselves have this issue of indirect authority and the fact that you can never completely control the behavior of the other people. And so that, therefore, a lot of the sort of, to address many of the complications of multi-level governance, we're going to need to bring in the tricks that we often use to deal with dotted lines, like professionalization, like transparency about desired outcomes, sort of constant monitoring, etc. Without those things, initiatives are often going to fail. All right, let's also talk briefly about an issue, a concept of public management policy that has sort of been in the background of every discussion we've had in this class, but that hasn't always been made explicit. And it makes more sense to sort of introduce it now than to foreground it, because I think hopefully it will make more sense now. So my question for you is basically, if you think about what you think public management policy might be, which of these would be an area of policy as opposed to public management policy? I'll give you a second to think about it. You can pause the tape if you need time. If you're looking at this, you might see that the thing that really looks different is taxation. So we can think about tax policy, and in fact we are thinking about tax policy right now in the US, but these other issues of financial management, labor relations, auditing, procurement, we can also put in budgeting, planning, a lot of these more support-oriented functions, as opposed to sort of things like protective regulation, are actually areas not of policy per se, but of the policies we use to manage all of these sort of operational departments in a government. So what's important about that is that, in essence, what a public management policy is are these sets of sort of government-wide rules and routines regarding these internal organizational processes. So again, budgeting, planning, procurement, HR, anything with labor relations, really, auditing and evaluation. So we've dealt with budgeting and stuff in the past. We're going to be dealing with it this week and also again next week. What these things are actual policy tools or sector innovations or sort of the culture or sort of norms of an organization. These are actual policies that dictate sort of how the company itself is run internally, how it deals with its internal resources, how it allocates resources, and how it procures things from the environment. So when we think about public management policies, we often will hear the government leadership talk about things like efficient, transparent, responsive, innovative. And in fact, these are watchwords that are often used to mean we don't want a corrupt government. We don't want sort of special favors. We don't want sort of insider trading. We want all these great, efficient, transparent, responsive, innovative type things. You'll see that activity-based management is one of these transparency, efficiency type initiatives. Same with auditing, right? These are all things that are being brought in to sort of improve an organization from the government leadership perspective. We can also call these, though, not really, you have to be careful because these words aren't necessarily actually describing, I mean, what does it mean to be more transparent and efficient? We know we can't come up with definitions, but they aren't always meaning what we mean, because these are really issue formulations or framing. You know, we are currently corrupt, we need to be more responsive. Like, what does that mean? Can you be more specific? Because in fact, what people within an organization tend to know, people who are managing programs, is that these are just the rules of the game. This is how you're getting resources from an organization. So not to be completely cynical, but you have to be very careful when you think about public management policies that anything that's supposed to improve transparency and responsiveness is really about you're changing who's winning and who's losing. And a good program manager, a good manager in general, is going to be savvy enough to recognize that and figure out what the new rules of the game are. And in some cases, as we can see, either interfere or, in fact, initiate actual backlash against these policies.